when Joanne approached me a little while ago with this idea, I said I'd be delighted to share some time with students, because after all, each generation that comes into play has a whole future to be involved with, and you will be, in one way or another, the future leaders of our world. And as such, it's important to have a better understanding of how we have come to where we are now, and where do we or could we go from here, irrespective of which culture or which nationality we represent, because after all, it is in fact a global community. And I think that the more we go in time, the more borders become more transparent, and the issue becomes more collective than only limited to a very narrow interpretation from a specifically domestic viewpoint. We cannot not be interdependent with others around the planet. Something that happens today in China may affect people in Canada or vice versa. Anyway, with this in mind, and before I start, and I know it will be perhaps easier both for you and me to do more of a Q&A type exchange today, but at least to give some bearing as to what Iran as a subject could be. Maybe there will be other subjects to talk about, but at least I can start with that one. Let me give you a very brief and very sort of schematic idea of what transpired in the past century, more or less. At the beginning of the 20th century, one major upheaval took shape in Iran. We refer to it as the constitutional revolution. By that meaning that people ultimately wanted to have a parliamentary system whereby the absolute authority of the monarch would be limited to a constitutional role, and it would be more an advent of democratic parliamentary democracy. And that happened at the turn of the century back in 1906, whereby there was a demand for such reforms. And in fact, there was a constituent assembly that formed, drafted a constitution that pretty much limited the authority of the monarch and permitted for a parliamentary system to take shape. It did not happen coincidentally. It happened because the era that took Iran from a very backward, underdeveloped, traditional country, entering an era of modernity and modern thinking, it was that process that was the basis and the desire for our society to evolve. And as such, modernity, secularism, concepts that would be certainly not alien to any of us today, but at the time was a novelty. It was really something that nobody had yet to really fathom and comprehend, was the order of the day. Clearly, when you talk about modernity and we talk about human rights and we talk about equality, for instance, equality of the sexes and things of that nature, usually there are some groups in that society that will be prone to show resistance towards that. And in fact, in this case, it will be the religious establishment. And from the very get-go, as Iran was entering its modern era of changes and new laws and right for women to vote and equality and so on and so forth, there was a great degree of resistance demonstrated by elements within the religious establishment. In the early 60s, when my father instituted a program that we refer to as the White Revolution, which was really a very hands-on concept of bringing in various elements of society into play by bringing major reforms, including land reforms, which was another big necessity of passing in a post-feudal era to a different sets of circumstances. Again, it was faced with a lot of resistance by the clerics, but nevertheless the country moved on. In the early 60s, Khomeini, who at the time was a very junior cleric, started stirring up a lot of problems and troubles, and there was a lot of conflict, and people died as a result of some of the actions that was taken. To make a long story short, he was exiled from Iran and lived from 1963 to about 1977, 78 in Najaf in Iraq. That's 1 year before the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which was recently, I shouldn't use the word celebrated, but on the 11th of February. It was the 34th year of this regime being in power in Iran. While the conflict between modernity and the regression, which was a little bit the mindset of the religious elements in Iran, was always at odds, what made a capital difference was that it was no longer just an issue of religion, but political ideology of religion. In a way, religion becoming an ideology to govern as opposed to a faith. As such, the whole theory behind Iran's revolution was the thinking and the viewpoint of those who actually believed that the world should be governed according to their interpretation of Islam. There has to be a faqih, or the tutelage of the learned, as they call it, a religious figure who is the only interpreter of God's will, and whatever he says is law, and that's it. And to export that ideology worldwide. Why do I bring this up? Because, in a nutshell, what we're facing today with radicalism, religious radicalism, which has nothing to do with the actual faith itself. If you look at close to 1 billion Muslims around the world today, maybe 10% of them might be inclined to think in those radical terms, whether they're Salafist or Wahhabist or supporters of the clerical regime. It does not represent the majority, the great majority of world Muslims. But it has become the problem. And here I would like to draw your attention to why is it that until now, whatever policy has been emanating from the free world has not worked vis-a-vis this particular problem. It's because I think there's a basic flaw in your expectation of rationality from the other side. Let me put it this way. Even at the height of the Cold War, when you had a Soviet totalitarian ideology in conflict with the Western viewpoint of liberty and freedom and democracy, you could argue that even in that bipolar world, there was a sphere of rational coexistence possible, by which you could even enter into some kind of treaties, like the MAD Treaty or SALT Treaty, until ultimately that system collapsed. But you could say that Khrushchev could still live on the same planet as John F. Kennedy. Whereas for Mr. Khamenei, who is the current leader, his objective is to make sure that America one day will become an Islamic republic, or for that matter, any other country. That's their vision. That's their whole purpose on this planet. They don't care about Iran or Iranians or even our identity. They think it really in terms of ideology. So to think that you can rationally come to terms to have a coexistence between everything that the Western world stands for in its values with a regime that to them, these values is like cyanide, it's like poison, otherwise they would have implemented themselves, cannot be achieved. And the reason I believe that the policies of the Western world dealing with this problem from the very beginning was flawed was because of this very reason. Your expectation that you can in fact come to a compromise and coexistence. Whereas if they failed to achieve their objective of exporting this revolution, they would have failed to justify their entire raison d'etre. Now, if they have more means to impose their will, like WMDs, it makes the job for them easier to force their hegemony regionally or beyond. In all of this, the problem is trying to find a way to compromise with an ideology and thinking that the nation in which this particular system has entrenched itself, taking the country as hostage and using all of its resources towards its aim, there has to be a separation of the people of that nation, what Iran is all about, and this regime who simply happened to have chosen Iran as a launching pad. They could have done it from elsewhere. Khomeini didn't care if he was in Tehran, or it could have been in Tunisia, or it could have been in Cairo. Why did he pick Iran? A, he spoke the language. B, Iran was a rich country. It had a strong military. It had all the means at its disposal, and was the perfect platform from which to launch this movement. To make a long story short, we are now in 2013. You all follow the news, the prospect of potential conflict, The discourse of world leaders warning Iran and the regime that if they don't stand down, they could face harsh reactions. The threat of not allowing Iran to achieve nuclear capabilities. Yet I have to hear a proposal that will say, how do you intend to do that? It's certainly not going to be voluntarily done by this regime. And you certainly cannot do it on your own. What is the missing ingredient in all this? So I would like to conclude with some of my thoughts as to where I think the solution could lie and where there has to be a complete change of direction for the entire crisis to ultimately be resolved. First and foremost, it is the understanding that as long as this regime is in place in Iran, nothing will change for the region or for the world in terms of all the problematics and threats that this regime represents, either for the people of Iran or for the world at large. So in short, we're talking about a complete change of regime. Maybe 10 years ago, regime change got a bad name or a bad rap. Just because it was not dealt with the proper way doesn't make it a bad concept. I think what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, which was not focusing on the center of the whole problem, was pretty much something that ended up serving more the interests of the Islamic Republic for anything than in fact the Western world, including the United States. In the sense that it ended up eliminating for Tehran two potential adversaries or foes that Tehran was concerned with. One was in Kabul, the Taliban, the other one was in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein. Thanks to America, they got rid of those two potential threats, and they have much more staying power and infiltration capabilities in either countries and beyond than any means or capabilities that the world has. And of course, they're relying on the very same old sort of what I call the Vietnam syndrome, which is how many body bags and how many victims and at what cost you want to sustain a prolonged war that end up not solving the problem. And they wait. They'll wait until you leave, and then they'll have open, if you will, means to pretty much establish themselves for good. And that is bad news for all of us. Why? Because we may reach a stage where nuclear proliferation will become unavoidable. It will become a new reality of our world, and God help us all if we get to there, because once Iran is there, guess what? The Saudis will do it, the Kuwaitis will do it, the Egyptians will do it, everybody else in the region will do it. And the thought that so many non-democratic countries in that region have potentially a nuclear weapon aimed at each other is not the kind of future I want your generation to have to worry about. There is a way to change all that. Not just that. It's radicalism, it's terrorism, it's a whole bunch of problems that are somehow linked or associated with this system. But how do you change it? As I said, diplomacy has failed simply because your expectation of a rational behavior from the other side was wrong to begin with. It was a waste of time. War cannot be the answer. It's a lose-lose proposition. It will, in fact, I think, contribute to a little bit more longevity of this system. It will certainly kill the prospect of a short-term solution to bring a democratic alternative to the country. It will have a spillover effect in the region. And it's not a guarantee that as a result of any military strike, the regime will collapse. Nor is a policy of sanctions for purposes of forcing a behavior change a solution. The only time you could have a solution is to add an element of domestic pressure on the regime. I believe in an approach that is based on civil disobedience and non-violence. I've followed very closely and studied what Gandhi did in India, what Mandela did in South Africa, and many other movements in our more modern history of the past 2 decades. Eastern Europe is a good example, which makes it possible with proper backing and support from the international community to help people from within organize themselves, have more means to overcome the system, not by taking arms in their hands and have street fights, no. By work stoppages, by massive labor strikes, something that would paralyze the system and force it to collapse. Certainly a much cheaper and more legitimate way of getting things done than by attacking the country and bombing that nation, adding insult to injury without solving the problem. Now this is still achievable while we still have time. But I'm not in control of that clock ticking. I'm not in control of when and where Israel will say our existential threat will force us to take some kind of an action. And God help us all back then, because it will impregnate the world with a conflict, and God knows what kind of a mess it will create. My proposal, my specific proposition, and I've been talking about this to various world leaders and governments and parliaments and what have you, is to say, look, if you have the decision of following a policy, this time of regime change, not by you doing it, but by helping Iranians to do it themselves, by helping them directly, helping the democratic secular forces who are inside Iran, who can, in a combination of your economic pressure from the outside and their organization and bringing civil disobedience from inside, enough to tip the balance. A collapse of the regime, it will be a controlled implosion. It won't be anarchy, so you don't know what will come out at the other end. You have the forces of civil society that will be part of the process and the solution. You are already strengthening them, so it's not a complete void. So if you take somebody like Mubarak down in Egypt, you don't know what is going to fill the void, and guess what's going to fill the void? The only groups that were organized underground all these years. And you can work in it as of now. If you don't want to have a question mark that in a post-Arab Spring, what could happen in all of these countries? And that has to be worked as of now, while there's still time. There's enough of a critical mass potentially existing in Iran. There's also a final thought that I think is important to also consider, because it's not change for the sake of change. The objective has to be very clear. And yes, I believe that even for a society that is living on an extremely repressive and brutal system, they can ultimately overcome it, provided that three key ingredients exist for people to actually move. Number one, the alternative should be very clear. It's not like in 1979 where people say, well, let's get rid of the Shah's regime, then we'll see what happens. Well, guess what? You end up with something that you never thought could happen, and yet it did, because nobody knew what the alternative was going to be. Oddly enough, the intellectuals who were the real cause for that revolution had no clue what Khomeini was really all about. We don't want to have the same thing happen again. Let's get rid of the regime, then see what happens. Not this time. The proposition has to be very clear. In general terms, what I propose is we're talking about a secular parliamentary democracy. I emphasize the word secular, which means a clear separation of powers of state and religion, which is a prerequisite to democracy. That has been proven, whether from Japan all the way to the United States. It is one of the key ingredients here. And being secular doesn't mean that you're anti-religious. Let me do that very clear. We don't have any problem with religion. Our problem is with religious governance. That is where you have the beginning of favoritism or everything that will segregate society. And anyway, the proof is in the pudding, as we say. The leadership has to be there too. People are willing to fight the fight, but if there's not clear direction, you cannot orchestrate such a massive movement on a national scale without having some degree of orchestration or cooperation. So leadership is key. And the third ingredient for society to ultimately move is to feel that they're not alone in this, that there's actual support from the free world. That's also very, very important in a scenario of nonviolent civil disobedience. In fact, none of the movements of civil disobedience in any of these countries for the past century have been successful had it not been for some degree of tacit international support for this or that movement. And as such, I think the potential certainly exists in this scenario that could concern my country. And finally, what's important today is to understand that while many political processes, including those that happened in the 20th century, would take much longer to permeate or to sink in people's mind because, well, communication was very primitive. I give an example. When I was first rejoined with my family after the revolution, I ultimately ended up in Cairo, Egypt, which was the last stop that my father had before he passed away in July of 1980. at the time, just making a simple telephone call, if you happen to have an international line, could take 3 or 4 hours just to be able to dial to Paris or to London or to anywhere else. Today you can be walking in the middle of the desert in the Sahara with your BlackBerry or iPhone and send text messages and sign up and watch a live clip on YouTube in the middle of nowhere. What I'm trying to say is that in this era of communication and access and information, people are far more aware, far more equipped, and far more connected. And the biggest nightmare for any totalitarian system is how to control information. So the quickest way to defeat totalitarian system is by increasing the flow of information, because knowledge is power. Information is critical. And the best way to help these nations is not so much to try to impose a system on them. They have to make that choice. That's why it didn't quite work in Iraq. You cannot establish a kind of Western concocted idea in a country that did not even exist on the map 8 years ago as a natural state. The important thing is to give them the information, give them the facts. Give them the facts in terms of news, give them the facts in terms of philosophies, conducts, what have you. Let them learn from that and say there is a better choice than having to put up with this or that dictator or this or that ideology. And I think these are the tools that you will be facing, much more than my generation did, and certainly much more than my father's generation had to deal with. At your fingertip, you can talk to anybody you want, anytime, anywhere in the world. That's a very powerful tool. And I think that most of the thinking goes along with the needs of the 21st century. I say to myself, if the 20th century was an era where government will deal with government over people's head, the 21st century is a relationship of people with people. And government are supposed to follow what people want, as opposed to people following what the government tells them to do. And that's the power that you, citizens of this world in your own respective societies and countries, really have. And that's the true power that has yet to be utilized. Because common sense, just common sense dictates that no matter which culture you come from, no matter which religion you have or don't have, no matter which orientation you have politically or otherwise, as human beings, at the end of the day, we want at least 3 most obvious things among others. Dignity and respect, opportunity that brings us a hope that we can achieve something, and justice. I don't care if you're Brazilian or Taiwanese, it's the same, isn't it? Really doesn't matter. We all want the same. And guess what? We can help each other without the need of in-betweens that have to regulate everything for us. The more we go in time, the more that desire can become the common aspect. We have so much more in common than we have differences. And that's the beauty of this whole image. Now, how do we sustain it? How do we maintain it? It's by increasing communication. So I really believe that people's power is not a slogan. It can be achieved if the tools are out there. Because we cannot anymore govern a world with any imperialistic designs, whether it's Western or Eastern or Northern or Southern. It doesn't work anymore. You cannot impose a will or an interest on any nation or any population anymore. It simply doesn't work. On the other hand, you create the incentive for cooperation. You create an incentive that people look after each other's interest. Let's take the Middle East as an example. Imagine this future where instead of each country, Iran, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and many others, I'm talking about the immediate region now, have to have God knows how many billions of money allocated to defense or military or what have you, rather than being spent on welfare or social issues. Something that could be achieved by drastically reducing the annual budget of these countries by having a regional pact of security and defense. Israel included, by the way. Imagine if there are enough Iranians that have invested money in Egypt, or Egyptians in Iraq, or Iraqis in Kuwait, or Kuwaitis in and so on and so forth. When people have to watch after each other's interests, does it really matter what the top echelon of the government thinks? Because they will be the first one wanting to preserve stability. Hey, I have a business there, I have a house there, I have a piece of land over there. I don't want to be in conflict with this country over what? You see what I'm getting at? And that can be achieved. This is the world we're going to face. But if we don't take an initiative, and that's my last comment, I promise, and then we can go do some Q&A. The biggest problem we've had in the 20th century is what I call the syndrome of silent majority. Silent majority are people who just go with the flow and often don't take a position. For this to succeed, people have to become far more proactive. In other words, you cannot just passively follow what happens. You can't just tune to CNN or, I don't know, Fox News or whatever and say, okay, somebody got killed today, there's a bomb that blew off over there, and okay, and then let's go have our dinner and watch TV or do something else. What I'm saying is that we cannot just know, because if we know and don't take any proactive action, it still won't be enough. We have to be far more proactive. And so what I'm hoping and what I'm trying to encourage today, young Iranians, people your age, and you as well, if I may be so bold, is to be very much proactive. Don't expect anyone to hear you. Make yourself heard at all times. You have to be aggressive in that approach, because the minute you stop taking a proactive stance, they will rather not listen to you, those who want to cling on to authority or power. That's the oldest trick in the book. And in that sense, vigilance and proactiveness will solve many, many different issues, I think. It will make us more aware of each other's thinking, for one thing. And the more we think alike, the more there's gravity, the more there is, I don't know, some kind of a centrifugal force that makes it the issue of the planet, the issue of society today around the world. Pick your subject. Could be against global warming. It could be against whatever. It's a matter of more and more people wanting, demanding it, observing it, educating themselves, caring about it enough to say, if we want it, we can achieve it. And far too often haven't we seen in history that there's been deviation. The moment people say, oh, well, that's taken care of, let me worry about my own thing. Guess what's going to happen? So this is the spirit that I hope we can have for our future. I'm trying to be my little part of it as it refers to my country. But I'll be the first one to admit to you that we certainly can't do it alone. And we certainly can do it much easier if we know we have people who will be watching after us, the same way we would like to be able to help those who one day might be in need and be in that position. From now on, let's talk about whatever you like to talk. If you have questions or if you have comments or ideas, by all means, I'm here for this. Thank you so much.